Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a recent book by Glory Liu entitled Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism, published by Harvard University Press about 3 months ago. Our discussants this afternoon are Sophia Rosenfeld of the University of Pennsylvania and Angus Bergen of the Johns Hopkins University. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar along with Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center. Christian is traveling today and won't be with us this afternoon. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association. For over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, and since the pandemic and post-pandemic times, here in the virtual realm. A few FYIs before we get going. First, please take note of next week's session on Felicia Kornbluh's recent book, A Woman's Life is a Human Life, My Mother, Our Neighbor, and the Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice. Second, this week's session and next are sponsored by the American Historical Association. Third, I'd like to thank and recognize Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. These two are the behind-the-scenes folks whose efforts make the seminar possible. Fourth, on the logistics front, please note, as always, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. Finally, when we get to the question and answer period in the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function on Zoom or the Q&A function. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with those preliminaries out of the way, let's get the seminar underway. Our author this afternoon is Glory Liu, a lecturer in social studies at Harvard University, whose interests lie in the realm of political theory, intellectual history, and political economy. She received her BA from the University of California, Berkeley, an MPhil from Cambridge in political thought and intellectual history, as well as a secondary degree in classics, and her PhD from Stanford in political science. Her articles have appeared in Modern Intellectual History, The History of European Ideas, the Adam Smith Review, History of Political Economy, and The Nation. She's not only a scholar, she is, I've learned, a contemporary ballet dancer who, as Harvard's website puts it, can be found in Boston's finest dance studios. Today, she'll be talking to us about her book published by Harvard University Press in late November 2022, entitled Adam Smith's America, How a Scottish Philosopher Became an Icon of American Capitalism. Glory, welcome to the seminar.
Thank you so much, Eric, and to the organizers of the seminar, to audience members who are tuning in from all over, and of course to Professors Rosenfeld and Bergen for reading my work and joining me today. As a longtime admirer of both of their works, it's inspiring and humbling and frankly a little terrifying to be sharing screen time with them here, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And just one quick addendum, the book was published by Princeton University Press, but easy to get the Harvard, Princeton, Yales confused these days. So the book is called Adam Smith's America, but it probably should have been called, or at least I wanted it to be called in an initial battle with my editor, America's Adam Smith. Because the book is not about how Adam Smith thought about America, but about how Americans encountered, reinterpreted, and debated Adam Smith throughout the ages. Smith, as I'm sure many people are familiar with, is popularly known as the father of economics, or more specifically, the father of free market economics. And his name and ideas have become a shorthand for the virtues of free markets and the vices of government intervention, especially in America. However, a persistent theme of contemporary Smith scholarship dating back to the 1970s and 80s has been that Smith is not an economist, or at least not just an economist. Instead, he's seen as an ambitious social scientist of the Enlightenment, a moral philosopher, a political theorist, whose wealth of nations was but one part of a larger science of man. And that science sought to reveal and explain the hidden forces that governed human behavior and human society in all realms of life, from moral philosophy to government to, of course, political economy. And in his first work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, Smith explored how and why people learned moral behavior through a process of imaginative projection and sympathetic exchange. He also had planned to work on the general principles of law and government, as well as a history of literature, philosophy, poetry, and rhetoric. He even wrote about dance. Neither of those two last great works was completed, though, and Smith ultimately had them burned before his death in 1790. So given the diversity and breadth of Smith's works, it's unsurprising that a common starting point and a complaint of many contemporary scholars is that Smith has been unjustly whittled down into a mascot for think tanks or a mere historical soundbite in many textbooks. What I offer in my book, Adam Smith's America, is a history of how and why that happened, and how the history of reading, reinterpreting, and debating Smith's ideas co-evolved with ideas in American political economy. And I showed that Smith's association with what we might call conservative or libertarian economics, especially these ideas of self-interest in the invisible hand, is a fairly recent historical invention. But also that there's a much larger history of enlisting and weaponizing Smith for various and often conflicting political purposes. As one reviewer put it recently, whatever your political views, there's a Smith for that. But beyond merely cataloging those instances and all those diverse Smiths, I really wanted to uncover how and why, at certain moments in history, Smith is thrown into high relief and becomes a valuable resource to use in those ways. So that's why I consider this a work of reception history. Now, reception history for me is a very active process of interpretation and invention and reinvention. It's the line between intention and impact that can help explain the difference between what Smith, or any author really, might have originally intended or meant, and what subsequent readers made of his ideas or her ideas, and what they did with those ideas. As inspiring works of reception history by authors such as Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen on Nietzsche's reception, Claire Arsenis on John Locke's reception in America, Emily Jones on Edmund Burke, these works show how reception histories are important because they can help us understand how and why certain ideas or certain ways of thinking or ways of reading become powerful and politically valuable. And these reception histories can help us understand why certain ideas become so powerful, so charged, that they often exclude other interpretations of the same ideas, the same texts, or the same body of work. As Kim Phillips-Fein suggested in her recent review of my book, I think reception history also encourages us to think about what intellectual history is. Do ideas live in the texts and the original intentions of authors? Or is what matters how ideas get used, reused, maybe even abused in contexts outside of the ones in which they were first born? So in the remaining time that I have, I'm going to highlight what I take to be three central themes or contributions of my book by way of a non-standard summary. The first point is a general one about the constructed and contested nature of Smith's reputation. The second point is about the elusiveness or the difficulty of finding a historical or authentic Adam Smith. And the final theme, which I don't articulate so much in the book, and I thought I would try out today as a kind of fresher or maybe even polemical take, has to do with how this reception history can help us understand or make sense of where Smith stands today. So first, Smith's well-known reputation as the father of economics and the father of free market economics is a belated construction. During Smith's lifetime, an elite group of American statesmen and thinkers saw his works as contributions to the Enlightenment science of man. Both the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations were quite well known and important texts during the founding era, but none of them seemed to exert any kind of fundamental paradigm-shifting importance. The theory of moral sentiments was read as a work that offered an enlightened way of thinking and reflecting on practical morality and the cultivation of virtue. A letter from the physician Elihu Hubbard Smith to his sister captures this orientation towards the theory of moral sentiments. And he exhorts his sister to read the work, believing that it will assist her in, quote, forming just notions of morality and criticism. Meanwhile, The Wealth of Nations has a different kind of practical relevance and importance during the founding era. By the mid-1780s, it's being used as the primary textbook for some of the first college courses on political economy. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, among other statesmen, recommend it on a list of books for Congress in 1783, and Jefferson hails it as the best book extant on political economy. Most notably, it's people like Alexander Hamilton, who are building the financial architecture and institutions of the fledgling country, who incorporates ideas from The Wealth of Nations into his treatises on the national bank, on public credit, and in his famous report on manufactures in 1790. So in the founding era, Those who were able to make use of Smith's ideas were really using his ideas, not his intellectual authority as much. The Theory of Moral Sentiments is seen as one book among many for individuals to reflect on private virtue and morality, and The Wealth of Nations is seen as a resource for American statesmen who were anxious to understand and guide the new nation on the cusp of a social, political, and economic transformation after independence. It's not until the 1820s that Americans begin to treat political economy as more than a branch of politics or the practice of enlightened statesmanship, though. Political economy became a science, a systemized body of knowledge about the production, consumption, and exchange of national wealth. And the expansion of instruction in political economy in higher education institutions and the explosion of new textbooks written for instructional purposes cements Smith's foundational status among American readers in this period. However, the significance of The Wealth of Nations' reputation as the foundation and textbook, as it's often called, of the science of political economy went beyond the simple fact that Smith had just become founding fatherized. Smith's American interpreters began to rethink the distance between Smith's time and their own. And they postulated the extent to which The Wealth of Nations was really a kind of timeless work, or whether it was really bound by its 18th century context. And so in making claims about what or which aspects of Smith's works were timeless scientific truths that transcended the time for which it was written, things like the division of labor, the distinction between productive and unproductive wealth, or productive and unproductive labor, and his definition of national wealth, and last but not least, the issue of free trade, Smith's American readers began establishing patterns for evaluating his legacy. And over the course of the 19th century, competing visions of the national political economy produced conflicting versions of Smith and his authority. Legislators from the South, for example, invoked Smith as the apostle of free trade in projecting their vision of a national economy built on low tariffs and, of course, the expansion of slavery as the engine of growth. Statesmen from the industrial and manufacturing North, meanwhile, could also invoke Smith, if only to openly refute his ideas and what he stood for. And they did this by appealing to precedents from other nations that proved free trade to be unwise, or they said that free trade was sound in theory but bad in practice, or that free trade was a British conspiracy theory foisted on Americans. Even after the Civil War, partisan debates over free trade intensified, turning Smith into little more than a mascot for free trade and The Wealth of Nations as a manifesto of laissez-faire. Perhaps the most famous construction of Smith as the father of economics, and more specifically, the father of a free market economics, is that of the so-called Chicago School Smith of the 20th century. Chicago economists of many stripes used Smith to unify and defend the substantive propositions of economics that had come under assault after the Great Depression. This idea that free markets under specific conditions could be self-regulating and self-stabilizing, and that the freedom to pursue one's rational self-interest underpinned the automaticity of markets. The invisible hand of the market, therefore, became this kind of unifying slogan, if you will. Right? The invisible hand of the market was posed against the messy irrationality and the heavy hand of government. And these kinds of claims were made powerful because of the shroud of scientific neutrality, objectivity, and authority that Chicago price theory and Chicago economists lent. Especially for figures like Milton Friedman and George Stigler, Smith provided a conceptual language and a recognizable intellectual authority that justified their view of the economy as operating through the miracle of free markets that required little guidance or little direction from planners and experts. And this view, of course, of the Chicago School Smith has been challenged in revisionist scholarship, but judging by the Wall Street Journal review of my book, still has a powerful hold in the wider public imagination of Smith today. Now, this brings me to my second theme. Smith's reception history reveals the elusiveness and the complexities of even the best attempts to recover an authentic, really historically grounded Smith, in contrast to a long history of oversimplified, reductive, often ahistorical versions of Smith. So one example comes from the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, especially from about the 1880s onward, there was a flurry of new commentary around Smith's historical significance, in large part because key elements of Smith's corpus were discovered, chief among them the first set of student notes on the lectures on jurisprudence. Smith's library was cataloged, new biographies are published, and new interpretive problems like Das Adam Smith problem emerge. Questions about the consistency, compatibility, and contemporary relevance of Smith for American audiences then were refracted through a much wider methodological debate about whether economics can and should be directed towards ethical ends. Cohorts of American economists who received their advanced training in Germany in the 1870s and 1880s brought back historicist sympathies and contributed to a lively debate over the ethical and political boundaries of economic science. And prominent new generation economists like Richard T. Ely and E.R.A. Seligman believed that political economy had foundations in social ethics, that, quote, self and others, the individual and society are thus united in one purpose. Moreover, Ely believed that Smith himself expressed such a conviction that government ought to step in and restrain individual liberty in order to protect and promote the liberty of society as a whole. E.R.A. Seligman, who was one of the most ferocious reviewers of new works on Adam Smith for economics journals, tried tirelessly to defend Smith from misinterpretation and misattribution by historicizing Smith, declaring that, quote, we must not make Smith responsible for the faults of his disciples. But in this attempt to historicize Smith, both Ely and Seligman were not only trying to subvert the neoclassical paradigm of their time, they were also subtly and radically remaking Smith in their image. So Smith's labor theory of value made labor central and pivotal, according to Ely. And those who would protest against labor legislation in Ely's time, right, he's writing this in 1896 in the wake of all of the labor agitation and violence. He says, we ought to remember that Smith described regulations that favored the workman as always just and equitable. In other words, Smith was the champion of labor in a time of crisis. In Seligman's words, had Smith lived in 1886, he would no less surely have been in the vanguard of the new school. So here's another example of this problem of, or this tension between kind of historicizing Smith and reviving him for contemporary purposes. In the 20th century, as many of the ideas of the Chicago's economists like Milton Friedman are reaching their zenith, neoconservative thinkers like Irving Kristol and Gertrude Himmelfarb turned to Smith, albeit with a very different degree of historical rigor, to redefine what it meant to live in a moral economy. By drawing attention to Smith's theory of moral sentiments, not just the wealth of nations, they tried to argue that Smith provided a way to restore the soul of capitalism, that capitalism isn't just about cold, calculating profit-seeking, but also about moral improvement and moral edification. Smith was central to Gertrude Himmelfarb's breakthrough work, The Idea of Poverty, which presented an interpretation of Smith that many people still hold today. Smith as a humanitarian thinker who was concerned about the least well-off, and that he had a radically egalitarian orientation toward the poor. But Himmelfarb, and even more so Irving Kristol, had a version of Smith that also smuggled in their own politics. Smith's organic theory of morality and his faith in individual moral agency and improvement suggested, on their reading, that the harsh forces of capitalism don't need to be reined in by government, but by individual moral agency in what they called wholesome institutions, like traditional family structures and organized religion. Now, this brings me to my third and final theme, and I promise I'm going to be wrapping up now. How does taking this long view of Smith's reception help us understand him better today? First, the dominant version of Smith today, right, self-interest and invisible hand Smith, is a politically motivated one. And in a sense, all Smiths are politically motivated. But we shouldn't let that fact scare us. Rather, recognizing that claims about who Smith was, what type of thinker he was, right, is he an economist? Is he a moral philosopher? Is he a political theorist? And what he stands for, free market capitalism, moral capitalism, these claims are always political. And knowing that can help us be more self-aware of why we feel it necessary to refract our politics through the lens of Adam Smith. Renewed interest in Smith, especially on subjects like inequality, corruption in commercial society, the normative stakes of economic growth, these are all really big topics today, and they serve a clear rehabilitative purpose in my view, and that is to cast Smith as a moral theorist of commercial society whose moral philosophy was not only compatible with, but foundational to his political economy. And these readings show how he was sympathetic and even how he was a sympathetic and even radical social scientist who cared deeply about inequality and saw room for the use of state apparatuses to achieve the ends of distributive justice. Now, to me, these new readings, not only were they the readings that drew me to Smith in the first place, but they also represent concerted efforts to use Smith as a guide to rethink the relationship between ethics and economics, moral and economic reasoning today, and to recover and explicate a vision of commercial society, and by extension, modern capitalism, as one that's defensible on moral grounds. Now, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that this new version of Smith as moral theorist of capitalism has a much wider appeal beyond scholarly interest. So just last December, amidst congressional efforts to avert a national railway strike, then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi invoked Smith as a surprising source of inspiration. I don't know if you all caught this, but it was on C-SPAN. And Adam Smith, she acknowledged, was familiar to most as the father of economics and the author of The Wealth of Nations. And she says, this is the gospel of laissez-faire, laissez-faire, which doesn't quite translate, but you kind of get the point. But, Pelosi pointed out, Smith wrote another book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And according to Pelosi, the message of the theory of moral sentiments was one of, quote, a more compassionate capitalism, that the strength of our economy and the strength of our workers go hand in hand. Now, to be clear, The Theory of Moral Sentiments is not a book about a more compassionate capitalism. And obviously, Pelosi's comments shouldn't be taken as a thoroughgoing attempt to recover a historical interpretation of Adam Smith's works. But I think her comment is emblematic of the way in which reimagining and enlisting Smith, not only as an economist, but as a moral philosopher, remains politically meaningful. Right? Smith is a vehicle to articulate our moral anxieties and also our hopes for capitalism, but without conceding its basic economic premises. And so what I would submit that the thing that's at stake here is more than a correct or very historically robust interpretation of Smith, or whether we've sufficiently rescued him from previous captors. Rather, what appears to be at stake is whether Smith can still serve as a useful guide for reassessing the morality of capitalism and also understanding what it takes, politically speaking, to create a more moral capitalism. I'll stop there. Again, thank you for this opportunity to share my work. I'll give the last words to Adam Smith. He said in a letter, I meant to have done more, and there are materials in my papers of which I could have made a great deal, but that is now out of the question. So I will hand it over to my esteemed colleagues to hear what they have to say, hear how I could have made a great deal more out of the stuff that I found, and hopefully get a clearer view of my own work.
Thank you very, very much. Our first discussant this afternoon is Sophia Rosenfeld, the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History and the Chair of the History Department at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches European and American intellectual and cultural history. She's the author of A Revolution in Language, The Problem of Signs in Late 18th Century France, published in 2001, Common Sense, A Political History, 2011, a book that won the Mark Linton History Prize and the Society for the History of the Early American Republic Book Prize, and Democracy and Truth, A Short History, published in 2019. She presented on the latter two books here at the Washington History Seminar. Her journal articles have appeared in the American Historical Review, the Journal of Modern History, French Historical Studies, and the William and Mary Quarterly. She received her BA from Princeton, her PhD from Harvard. She's a former editor of the the Modern Intellectual History, and is a past president of the American Historical Association's Research Division. Sophie, welcome back to the seminar.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, Glory, for that very interesting introduction to your book. And I'm going to keep my remarks fairly informal, and I'm going to start by saying that this book made me a little bit nostalgic. When I was a student in the 80s and early 90s, reception history was actually all the rage. There are probably some people in the audience who remember this. It was a big moment for the history of reading and readers, in part inspired by the Annales School, a lot of interest in who read what in what material forms, how did different kinds of people make sense of different kinds of texts, from Rousseau to Betty Friedan, and even how did the practice of reading itself change. And in some ways, this promised for intellectual historians and cultural historians like me, a way to link social life with events. And at the same time, literary critics for taking up reception theory, the premise that the audience, in a sense, always makes the meaning of the work, and that the reader is always an active participant or the looker in creating meaning. Hans Robert Jauss was read by many of us and made us think, in contrast to a kind of earlier formalism, a lot about how readers and viewers transform meanings over time and space. And now here we are in whatever year this is, 2023, I suppose, and Glory Liu is presenting us her book as a form of reception history. It's actually not a book that's heavy on theory or method. And in some ways, it seems somewhat far from those concerns, though it certainly builds on them. But I would say the interest here lies in how throughout US history, a combination of intellectuals, academics, and a few political figures, especially in the early period, have interpreted the key works of Adam Smith, and mainly how they've taken up concepts and words in Adam Smith and used them to accomplish things in their own texts. In other words, her emphasis in some ways, in keeping with people she mentioned in her remarks just now, like Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen, is on texts that, in a sense, remade texts, especially in the realm of political thought, throughout American history. And in this case, Liu aims especially to explain in a kind of teleological fashion how we got the Adam Smith that, at least in the wider culture, most of us are familiar with, the iconic figure who's considered the early champion of limited government and free markets, governed by an invisible hand and individual self-interest, and seeing all of this as somehow the key to a kind of modern version of freedom. To this end, Liu very ably and eloquently takes us through the different phases and kinds of reception, even the different spaces of this repurposing, from the halls of government to universities to by the time we get into the 1970s, television. And I won't rehearse, since she did such a good job just now, the sort of phases through which this book goes. I will say that one of her biggest arguments is perhaps not fully demonstrated, that the debates over the reading of Smith have had a large impact on the US, aside from the fact that Friedman's popularization did get a lot of TV attention. And some historians might be frustrated that she doesn't offer much evidence that the ideas ultimately do more than engender, say, academic debates and have consequences for ordinary lives, or even for the policies or business practices that shape ordinary lives. So one might be able to say that some of these uses of Smith could be taking, even this one we just talked about, Nancy Pelosi, as a kind of window dressing, a sort of status symbol that it's useful to claim when you have predetermined positions, or something only of concern to specialists. Intellectual historians say, having arguments at Harvard about the nature of Smith. That's possible that some people will feel that the sort of what does it all amount to is harder to see in this. But I would say that Liu makes a very convincing case that for certain public intellectuals in the US, Smith has always been a kind of Rorschach test in which thinkers subsequent to Smith have seen what they wanted, given their own needs and predilections, but even more, that their responses themselves have something to teach us about intellectual strife in their own moment. In other words, we might learn less about Smith himself from this project than we might learn about how Smith is a catalyst for new kinds of thinking about the economy and the state, or about even the nature of human nature in different moments. In fact, one could see her book as the last entrant in the very story she tells. Her reception history is billed as a historical project. It's not a normative one, clearly. But what we have between the covers could be also thought of as maybe another version of an academic remaking of Smith for our own times. And by that measure, the response to it, which has been very robust for his first book, which should tell something perhaps about the continuing magic of the name Adam Smith, but even the response to it should, by this method, tell us something about the range of opinion on these very questions, like the economy and the state or human nature right now. So I tried, after reading the book, to read all the current reviews and see what I could learn. So I'm going to give you a kind of quick overview in my remaining 5 minutes and see if we can learn something about how to actually put this book into the story that Liu is telling. So I'll start, well, and I'll sort of go across the political spectrum a little bit. One of the rare negative reviews by Barton Swaim, an editorial page writer in the Wall Street Journal, attacks the book in defense of essentially the libertarian or laissez-faire reading of Smith of the Chicago School. And he sees treating Smith, as Liu does, as both a disguised attempt to undermine the correct free market capitalist reading and the victorious image of Smith that he'd like to see stand. And he uses the opportunity to challenge, in a mode that's kind of common at this moment, the ideology of today's universities as engaged in a kind of sleight of hand that he sees as undermining a conventional understanding of what capitalism is. He announces sarcastically that the academic consensus somehow perfectly matches the center-left consensus. Amazing! Exclamation point. So that's sort of one reading, is to say the book itself needs to be countered in a defense of laissez-faire capitalism. Then I read David Bahnsen, a financial professional in Religion and Liberty Online, who also rejects the idea of Smith as a quote-unquote social justice crusader, unquote, as ludicrous, and accepts much of the free market reading of Smith, but praises Liu's book, seeing her historicizing efforts as encouraging a reading of Smith as a moral as well as economic philosopher. And that brings us really to that kind of Irving Kristol reading that she mentioned earlier, and sees this, both Smith and Liu's reading of Smith, as an opportunity for a renewed engagement with the traditional moral foundations of capitalism. And another finance professional, Ashley Lester in Foreign Policy, asks, what do we do with Smith, given that economics today is essentially a mathematical science? Has economics really developed independent of Smith, despite the publicity campaign of Milton Friedman? Or is Smith there all along? And in all of these kind of sort of center to center right readings, we see some of the kind of bifurcation of the right now, looking for answers still to critical questions, I think, about the ethical dimensions of capitalism and how much they should matter. And I would say this is for the right and for maybe the world of commerce altogether. It's important that these are people who are writing in the Wall Street Journal and as finance professionals. These questions are quite unsettled, but interestingly, they seem similarly unsettled as the reviews move to sort of center left and beyond readings too. Kim Phillips Fine, who's I would describe as a left leading professor of new capitalist history, writes in the New Republic and praises Liu's efforts as ultimately an account of how reductive the free market capture of Smith was. And she too uses the opportunity to turn Smith once again into something else, this time into a plausibly progressive thinker with egalitarian impulses, deep skepticism about employers who claim to be acting in the public good, concern about the implication of specialization on the psyche of workers, commitment to public education. But Phillips Fine also wonders if this is enough. Is it enough to sort of give a richer account of Smith? Or are there tensions within capitalism that Smith can't really help us identify? And is there an opportunity here for a critique of the system as a whole? And I think this is really emblematic of much of the left today that is really torn in some sense about, can we make capitalism better? Or are such reforms ultimately past their sale date? And finally, Adam Willems, who's a freelance journalist, writes in The Stranger. A review's title includes the words, "the fuckery of free markets," which might tell you all you need to know right there. But the question is essentially, why we need to throw out Smith and everything that goes with him, even if that just means market fundamentalism. In a sense, he's asking us, like much of a younger generation, to challenge the validity of anything associated with capitalist thoughts. So in other words, none of these reviewers can help but slot themselves into Liu's story, just as she does herself, and indirectly I'm doing right now. Smith, and now Liu's Smith commentary, no matter how historically centered, offers reviewers an opportunity to comment on the state of American capitalism and politics right now, where there are new challenges on the right and left alike. But perhaps the most interesting response, I thought, came from Colin Kidd, the British historian in the New Statesman, who asked something a little different. Why are we still having this debate? Why does anyone want Smith on their side anymore? Especially since economics isn't a subfield of belles lettres or moral philosophy anymore. The real mystery is why he isn't confined to history once and for all. And this strikes me as a bigger question about reading and reception history, one I think worth returning to, and that I hope maybe you yourself will have some interesting things to say about. This kind of reception history leads us to ask some new questions about Smith himself. Is there something about his textual production, its foresightedness, its multiplicity and digressive nature that leads to such varied interpretations? Or is this typical of Enlightenment writers who might, in a sense, be useful to us because they never stayed in the narrow lanes of field or genre or style? That's one question about reception history. But going back to Kidd, I think we might ask another question. Why are thinkers like Smith, or for that matter, Tocqueville or Nietzsche, still important in American democratic thought? Why do we want these guys on our side? Is it because they're simply good to think with? Or is there some need to keep quoting kind of old world European thinkers for their imprimatur and authority that gives some substance to otherwise free-floating ideas? And in this age of populist politics, when universities often seem farther than ever from lived politics on the one hand, and technocratic solutions derived from a more mathematical kind of economics are in the ascendance on the other, will this continue? Liu uses the word we a lot in the book, and I did wonder who that we was sometimes. In the past, it seems to have been largely kind of political figures and more often academics. But one does wonder, will any of the we's that have public authority continue to evoke people like Smith in the world going forward? And what does it mean that, in fact, we still seem to be doing it right now? I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Glory, if you have thoughts or responses to some of what Sophie said, we could hear them now.
Yeah, thank you so much for those really beautiful comments. I think you have a clear sight of the book and what I was trying to accomplish, and also what I wasn't able to accomplish it. And I'm so grateful for, always hearing another reading of this. And I really like how you situated a reception history or like done a reception of the reception history and thought about what that says about the origin or like the thing that's underneath it all, which is Smith, right? Like, what does the reception of the reception history say about Smith himself? And I thought I would just try and tackle the last two questions. So what does this say about Smith himself? And what does this say about why Smith might still be important in American thought or just wider discourse today? So one thing that I've come to appreciate about Smith himself is something that I think you mentioned and something that I think Kim Phillips Fine mentioned, right? That the thing that makes Smith so susceptible to the kind of rereadings, reinventions, weaponization is the ability, how do I say this? He was able to do something that we're not able to do today, which is to transgress disciplinary boundaries, right? He was able to kind of take a way of thinking about human nature, human society, and these grand narratives of like changes in law and government, as well as political economy, and traverse those boundaries so fluidly because he wasn't kind of disciplinarily siloed the way we are. But I think part of that also lends itself to the way he could go on observing, pointing out tensions and contradictions in, say, the way that merchants were simultaneously like the heroes that brought down feudalism, but then also the villains that made commercial society so liable to state capture, right? That he is actually kind of ambiguous. I don't think he doesn't necessarily contradict himself, but some people think that he's like liable or susceptible to contradiction because he was just so careful, thorough, and Donald Winch says that he's infuriatingly balanced. And I think it's rare, today at least, to encounter a thinker who is so well considered and goes on these digressions and tries to point out kind of historical exceptions to a theory that he posits, which the theory itself is drawn from kind of historical formulation. But because Smith not only wrote so much across different disciplinary boundaries, but he was very conscientious and very careful and balanced in his way of thinking. That makes him very liable to one-sided readings, right? So for every time he says something along the lines of, free trade promotes overall growth and wealth and liberty, he'll say, oh, but actually in these cases where you need infant industry protection or the priorities of national defense or national defense takes priority, therefore you need an active government to step in. You might read those two things and think Smith is contradicting himself, when in fact he's actually just trying to think of every possible scenario and every contingency and account for that possibility. So I think that's the thing that I want us to appreciate about Smith himself, right? That he was kind of one of these thinkers that was able to do something that we feel like maybe we're not able to do so much today. So why are thinkers like Smith still important? It's hard to answer this question because I want to say it's because Smith is important. I think early on, certainly in the 18th century, Americans are looking for authorities that are drawn from mostly European sources, but that doesn't fully explain why we get stuck with them. And I don't want to make an argument about path dependency, right? Just because we started needing to appeal to European sources and drawing from a kind of constellation of European and British thinkers, that we get stuck with them. I think part of my answer, and sorry, I'm thinking on the fly here, because it's a really good question and it's hard for me to answer without I feel like reverting to part of my previous answer to the question, or my answer to the previous question. I do think that there's something specific about Smith's authority being tied to economics. And so maybe this is what differentiates him from somebody like Tocqueville or maybe somebody like Locke, that the trajectory of political economy and economics in America, maybe not so much today because of the mathematicalization and formalization of the discipline, but for so long, I think really was tied to a kind of not reductive appeals to authority, but really reflecting on precedent and texts like Smith in order to give maybe form and structure and style to the discipline and the style of reasoning that economics demands. And I think there's something about Smith maybe acquiring a kind of halo around what he did to shape the field and to kind of give the world, but also America, maybe a way to think about their peculiar position in history relative to kind of the development of the old world, but also a way to think about the possibilities of creating something new and how to manage and think about the forces of national wealth. So it's not a great answer, but I do think that maybe the peculiarities of why Smith is still so important has to do with the way he's kind of entangled with development of economics as a discipline in America. I'd love to hear other answers to that question, but maybe we should move on and then come back and discuss. Maybe I'll have better thoughts.
Thank you. Before we move on, though, let me just say to those in the audience, now is the time, should you be so inclined, with a question, to use the raise hand function or to pose a question with the Q&A on Zoom. If you use the raise hand function, I can call on you, you can unmute yourself, and you can pose the question yourself. If you use the Q&A function, then I get to read your question for you. So I would encourage you to use the raise hand function to get a more variety of voices here. So queue up should you so desire. Our second discussant this afternoon is Angus Bergen, Associate Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University, where he focuses on U.S. and transnational intellectual history, the history of technology, and the history of moral and political economy. He is the author of The Great Persuasion, Reinventing Free Markets Since the Depression, which won the Merle Curdy Award and the Joseph Spengler Prize. He's the executive editor of the University of Pennsylvania Press's Intellectual History of the Modern Age book series, and he's a former editor of Modern Intellectual. Working on a paper just 2 weeks ago, an essay of his from 2019 helped me break through a logjam in my thinking as I was writing about automation and African-American labor in the 1960s. So for that essay in particular, I thank you. Angus, welcome to the seminar.
Thanks so much, Eric. Thanks to the seminar for the invitation to participate in the conversation, and also to Sophie for her very perceptive comments. I'm going to double down on some of them a little bit later, but it's an honor to be a co-panelist with her. And also to Glory for writing the remarkable book under discussion today. So I'm going to focus my comments on raising maybe four sort of overarching broad questions that I have in reading the book. But before digging down into them, I do want to just take the opportunity to recommend it to anyone who hasn't had the chance to read through it. It's beautifully written. It's kind of extraordinary in covering more than 200 years of the history of political economy, while at the same time remaining tightly focused and easy to read. There are very few books I could say that about. And I think in many ways, it's a model of how to undertake reception history using a single figure to think about the shifting assumptions about political economy expressed by readers in different eras and contexts. But like any good history, it answers many questions and raises many more. And so as a starting point for conversation, I want to just draw out a few of those before getting to the broader questions from the audience. So the first big question I'd like to raise is about the directionality of the argument. So in the introduction, Glory writes, one of the central arguments of this book is that successive constructions of Smith's significance and import often tell us less about the content of Smith's ideas themselves and more about the grounds on which his interpreters believed his authority rested. And the book treats us to many different discussions of Smith, which gained credence in different moments and were leveraged to achieve very different ends. I guess my question about this is which aspects of the treatment of Smith have a kind of defined linear development over the course of the narrative? That is, what changes? And which aspects of these conversations are merely recursive, just cycling back and forth between different poles with nothing that looks like a meaningful accumulation or progression? And I ask this in part because there is a way in which aspects of the book read as very much recursive, right? We get this sort of free trade version of Smith at Delmonico's, and then we get this sort of institutionalist reversion that, as Glory referenced in her opening comments, tiptoes to the very edge of socialism, and then it's supplanted by this Chicago kind of reinvigoration, at the same time maybe recreation of the free trade Smith, which then is subverted by the revisionist emphasis on his political complexity and historical contingency. So you can see there's like a ping pong ball aspect of this history, right? Where at different moments in time that present different circumstances, different communities have reasons to leverage their own vision of historical Smith to advance whether a left-leaning or a right-leaning interpretation. But then at the same time, there are these sort of subterranean shifts that emerge over the course of the book, right? There's the emergence of a new science of political economy that becomes ever more professionalized and specialized. There's discovery of Smith manuscripts, right, that actually meaningfully alter our capacity to interpret the historical Smith. There's the famous story of the invisible hand as it migrates from a kind of marginal aside into this sort of central, like a synecdoche for Smith as a whole. But when I put the book down, I wasn't sure in the end whether it was more a story of change over time or more a story of a sort of ongoing continuity as Smith is invoked for different purposes, but with no inherent directionality to those evolving conversations. And so I'm curious which of those pathways Glory would take in describing what the implications of the book should be and how we as readers should adjudicate that sense of continuity and change. The second big question is what this book tells us about America. I take under advisement Glory's comments about conversations with editors about how to name the book, but you do at the end of the introduction say you embrace, this even if editorially imposed, embrace this title for the book and say the book's title hints at the ultimate irony in the story of Smith's reception, that Americans might be captive to the very ideas of an Adam Smith that they invented. It is Adam Smith's America now, right? So there is an idea here that Adam Smith tells us something distinctive about America, that it can contribute to a broader, multi-century academic conversation about the meaning of America in some distinctive way. So that's obviously a huge question that's sort of unanswerable, but I maybe can narrow on it in two different ways. One came out a little bit in Sophie's comments from a few moments ago, and that is to what extent is Smith's perceived foreignness important to his reception in the United States? It is striking that so many of these reception histories that have just come up in conversation right now are reception histories not of Americans, but of foreign theorists being reappropriated in an American context, right? Whether Tocqueville or Burke or Nietzsche or so on. But I didn't necessarily leave the book with a clear sense of how Smith's foreignness actually played into his interpretations over time, whether and how and to what degree his identity as a non-American related to his identity as in some ways the ultimate American theorist, and what we should make of that irony or paradox. A second way of framing it might be, how might the history of Smith's reception in other national contexts compare to the story of Smith's reception in America? And does that tell us something about the distinctively American aspects of the story of his reception here? There are moments in the book where we do get glimpses of his reception elsewhere in the world as people travel back and forth. But that broader kind of comparative question, which in some ways does frame the distinctively American aspects of the story, opens up questions that I'd be curious to hear Glory's thoughts about. A third broad question is about something that came up in Sophie's comments and in Glory's comments at the outset, which is about the methodology of reception history. You say in the book, and then you reiterate it again in your comments, this book treats reception history as the line between intention and impact. And I guess one question that raises for me is whether or how someone working on reception history can or should be thinking about the intentionality of the author whose reception is being traced, and how you see yourself as navigating that boundary in this text. I ask that in part because the text seems to fluctuate in some ways between bracketing Smith as anything like a kind of stable historical figure whose intentionality can be deduced, or whether you seem very hesitant as an author to adjudicate whether or not an interpretation of Smith is correct or not, as say a conventional history of a discipline written from within a discipline might be inclined to do, right? But at the same time, there are moments where your interpretive voice does emerge in your depiction of how Smith is invoked in certain contexts relative to others, right? And so certainly the story that you have to tell about the Chicago School and Friedman and Stigler is in part a kind of very explicit history of a persuasive manipulation or massaging of Smith's ideas. It might be emphasized more there than in other contexts, which hints at, I think this is what that Barton Swain review that Sophie picked up on in her comments was trying to get at, hints at an underlying possible sort of normative or dimension or interpretive stability in a reception history that otherwise is fairly scrupulous about trying to emphasize that Smith's multiplicity is not a product of incorrect and correct interpretations, but rather the inherent multiplicity of the text and maybe the unknowability of any author in some deeper sense. So I guess I just wanted to create an opening for Glory to talk through how you were thinking about that challenge and maybe leveraging the book as its own kind of persuasive contribution to a broader literature on Smith, even while at the same time trying to bracket the book from those conversations in other ways. It's an inherent problem in reception history that I'd be curious to hear you say more about. And my final question really has already been covered in large part by Sophie, but I will ask it again just to pull out a different dimension of it. And here's how I'll frame it: that if you were to write you have a unique experience now, having for a long time had the position of being able to serve as a kind of distanced observer of this broad historical panoply of different interpretations of Smith. And now over the course of the past year, you have yourself become a participant in that, right? Whether willing or not, the book has become, by virtue of the very reviews that Sophie cited, a kind of vehicle in these broader historical processes of trying to manipulate Smith to achieve some political end or another. So I guess rather than sort of dwelling on that process itself or what it necessarily means about the political left or right in the present day context, if you were to write on the basis of your experiences inhabiting the history that you've written, if you were to write a little epilogue of the book that dwelled on what that tells us about how ideas about Smith are changing or evolving today relative to the prior generations that you've covered over the course of the book, what might you say? So that's it. Those are, I know, excessively large questions, but they're intended just as a kind of opening to the conversation that we're about to have.
Thank you, Angus. Glory.
Thank you, Angus. They're just so incisive and clear and helpful. And very grateful to have had you on the team from very early stages of this book until now. And I know you raised some of these questions early on and I still didn't answer them, but let me see if in conversation something emerges. So I'll try to be kind of efficient here and maybe at the cost of like a really good substantive answer. But the question about the directionality of the argument, is it ping-ponging or is there something linear? I want to say yes, it's both. But I want to add to kind of your dimensions of the ping-pongingness and also the linearity. So I would say that one of the kind of ping pong ball aspects of the directionality, or maybe lack of directionality, is swinging between like different modes of interpreting Smith, right? Like, is Smith a timeless resource that we can go back and mine for quotes to use for our political purposes, versus is he a text that we need to, a text and a figure that we need to treat really historically, right? And kind of really distant. So there's the kind of historicization versus politicization. I think that swings back and forth quite a bit. And then the maybe more subtle, but also linear direction, I would add the increase in the academic division of labor. Like with the professionalization, you also get divisions among different disciplines and how they're reading Smith. And I think that's something that, like, with the proliferation of different fields and subfields, you get the proliferation of all these different Smiths. And, I don't know whether we can, judge all these different Smiths from like philosophy versus economics versus political, history and intellectual history, political thought and intellectual history. Like you said, like, I try really hard to not judge them, but I do think that there is something to the effect of the kind of like intellectual division of labor, where we see both like a thickening of approaches to Smith, but constrained within disciplinary methodologies. So not necessarily tied to kind of like a single stable version of Smith, but maybe tied to kind of newer disciplinary and methodological commitments within that discipline that change over time in an ever proliferating manner. What does this book tell us about America? I'm going to answer one of the sub-questions. To what extent is Smith's perceived foreignness important? I think it's actually quite important, especially kind of pre-20th century. So first, it's Smith's Scottishness that I think is particularly compatible with the like enlightened way of thinking that we see in like John Adams and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. But there's not much wariness. Actually, maybe Sophia can answer this question better because of her work on this period as well. But I would say it's something about the kind of Scottish sensibility that is very conducive to the way Smith is read early on. But you can see there's a delicacy in the way that American statesmen tiptoe around Smith's foreignness in the free trade debates, because it's not so much his Scottishness, it's the fact that he's a British thinker, right? And so he gets kind of lumped in with the Anglophobic tendencies that are associated with kind of like apocalyptic free trade rhetoric. And so Smith becomes this like outsider, and we shouldn't believe him because he's British, and free trade is this British conspiracy. And so we kind of forget the Scottishness and the kind of initial conduciveness and alignment on the Enlightenment thinking, and suddenly he becomes representative of a foreign way of thinking that's inapplicable for American circumstances. Interestingly, I think by the 20th century, certainly by the time we get to the Chicago School, it's the fact that Smith is an outsider that's important. It's like, oh, here's somebody who's outside of America that saw something about how America would develop and how America would be kind of exceptional. And I think we get hints of that. And the fact that Smith, so Friedman says that like the wealth of nations is, or no, he says the Declaration of Independence is the political twin of the wealth of nations. He wants to like assimilate kind of an outsider with Americanness and make Smith American. And I think there's something to that kind of outsider insiderness that makes him even more powerful. The methodology of reception history. I was flying by the seat of my pants writing this book, but I maybe just, if there are like younger scholars in the audience or just people who are curious to know kind of how I made these decisions, maybe I can just say a few words about that. I don't think this is by no means kind of prescription or a defense of what I was doing is the correct way to do things, but I can just maybe illuminate how I tried to tread around decisions about when to interpret more and when to kind of withhold some of that interpretive voice. I was coming at this as somebody trained in both political theory, but also intellectual history. So on the one hand, there was this tendency to want to kind of recover Smith as somebody who you could, somebody who was participating in contemporary debates about poverty, inequality, justice, impartiality, sympathy. And then the other tendency as a kind of like Cambridge-trained contextualist was to say, no, we're only going to care about the language that Smith himself used and try to understand the authorial intentions in Smith's own time. So maybe some of the tension that you're reading or the inconsistency is precisely because I was trained in these two different disciplines and I had to figure out ways to balance them. I will say that like, I do think that while there might not be a single stable or unified Smith, there are certainly better and worse, or maybe better and worse is not the right term, but there are like more and less historical versions of Smith and maybe thicker and thinner versions of Smith. So I would say that like the Friedman Smith, while it's not completely inaccurate, is certainly like radically simplified and thin. But in fact, it's the thinness that makes it very powerful. And the like thicker, more historical versions of Smith that you see from like somebody like E.R.A. Seligman or even Donald Winch, they didn't necessarily get everything right, but you do get more texture, you get more of that complexity, and you see more of a willingness to I think what you see in those readings is you see kind of concessions to Smith being a very complicated thinker. What would I do differently? Knowing what I know now, maybe not have written this book. Just kidding. I had a great time writing this book. It was very daunting. I think I've said this in articles that are forthcoming where I actually could take a little bit more time to think about some of the lessons. Maybe not some of the normative lessons, but the lessons for how we think about Smith and how ideas evolving or how ideas around Smith are evolving today. One thing is that I think if you look at kind of the world of professional Smith scholars and Smithology, you can see how Smith is often used as a vehicle to fill in the gaps for kind of critiques of liberalism and capitalism. So especially when it comes to kind of liberalism and its discontents, if liberalism is too rational, Smith offers a sympathetic liberalism. If liberalism is kind of like cosmopolitan, or if liberalism is maybe too, I don't know, nationally contingent, Smith's liberalism is somehow cosmopolitan. Or if liberalism is, I forgot, I listed all of these different versions of kind of like Smith as a foil for contemporary criticisms of liberalism. So I think that's something that is much more pronounced now. I think the other thing that is very, I think really like, what's the word I'm looking for? Something that's very contested still is to what extent we have to align or like reconnect the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations. So something that I didn't mention in my opening comments, but also kind of plays a key theme in the book is this idea of Das Adam Smith problem, like an interpretive problem that introduces, or it's a question that poses a serious interpretive problem for quite some time, but then is very quickly dismissed as like not a problem, which is how could Smith have written both the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations? Because on the one hand, you have a vision of human nature that's governed by sympathy, and the other, a vision of human nature and human society governed by self-interest. How are these things philosophically compatible? And then did Smith change his mind or have a change of heart somehow? So I think while most Smith scholars today recognize that that is absolutely not, it's not a problem either in the philosophical sense or in the sense of Smith's own intellectual development, there is still this question of how do we read these texts, not just the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations, but also the lectures on jurisprudence and his history of astronomy as part of a unified corpus. And the thing is that like, for me, this raises questions about like how are we supposed to understand a thinker, and how do we understand the question of intentionality? So this is another question you answered. I maybe this is a very, very controversial take, but I do see that that there is this tendency to kind of overcorrect for the mistakes of the past and want to say everything is unified, right? And that like the theory of moral sentiments lays the groundwork for the wealth of nations. And then Smith goes back to the theory of moral sentiments, and the lectures on jurisprudence have to be read in between the two. And all of this is governed by the imagination, which is the faculty that Smith wrote about in his essays on astronomy, right? So there is this need to find a unified, Smith who foresaw kind of every step of his intellectual development, and that we could read his corpus as kind of like one thing. And I just don't think that that's possible. Like, I think that we should grant authors change, mistakes, and also that like the theory of moral sentiments is actually posing a very different question than the wealth of nations. And while there might be rhymes and echoes and similarities in method, it doesn't necessarily mean that that you have to kind of find every single intertextual connection. So I think that is one thing that I didn't quite address in the book, but that's like a tendency that I've become kind of more attuned to as I've reflected on the kind of directionality actually of what I've been tracing in the book. So I'll stop there with my scattered and somewhat incoherent remarks.
Thank you. No, that was quite good. We have a number of people with their hands up, so I'm just going to alert the first three in the queue. So please stand by if you're second or third. Elizabeth Shermer, if you will unmute, you can pose a question. But Leon Fink and Larry Glickman, please stand by. Ellie, welcome.
Hi, I'm really excited. I heard Gloria Liu talk about this project a little bit at the Intellectual History Conference in Boston, so I'm really excited to have it here in Wilson so we can hear more about it, besides all the reviews that the commentators went on. And I, as someone who is, for complicated reasons, really interested in reception, I think one of my questions, like, who else would it be who Americans have contorted? I know Andrew Hartman is coming out with a book soon on Marx in America, but I find it interesting, and I know that Angus got to that in his questions as well, is what is it about this person, particularly in the field of economics? I guess maybe we have it with Hamilton, who's also one of these figures who's not quite, what is he? How do we think of Alexander Hamilton? But I was thinking, why not Henry George? Maybe in a very upper division undergraduate seminar, we talk about the single tax. Professor Liu mentioned Eli in her remarks, but I feel like it's Frederick Winslow Taylor who is much more larger, well-known, but he's not, again, not really an economist, or maybe he is, he's a managerial specialist. But why is it, or would you guys disagree, that Keynes doesn't have the same power in the United States? And I know Angus wrote about this in his first book, Wood Friedman, is Paul Krugman someone prepped to have this sort of larger than life? And if it's not necessarily this question of the economy and the question of capitalism in the United States, besides the fact that John Locke was Scottish, is this really about the reception of the Enlightenment that we're talking about? And I was thinking about, I don't wish I had said that, or I wish I'd read it, but it's been a long time since I've read Louis Hartz's big book on the liberal tradition in America. But I'm wondering if it's not just that he's Scottish, not just that we don't sure what to call him, but also he's this creature of the Enlightenment, which also sort of looms large, and the memory of it, the understanding of it has changed so much since the founding.
Thank you. Lori?
Thank you for that. It's a really, really great question. And I could, spend the afternoon brainstorming other figures who we can chart kind of twists and turns in their reception history. I'll just make a plug for Claire Osenis's really, really excellent book, America's Philosopher, which is an intellectual history of John Locke's reception in America. Claire was one of the original inspirations for this book, and I tried my very best to make my book as good as hers. But I think you're right that there is something about the Enlightenment and the legacy of the Enlightenment and reinvention of the legacy of the Enlightenment and what that means for kind of like what is the character of American ideas, like with a capital A, capital I. I think, Smith is kind of like, in terms of other figures who kind of get distorted and used in these like really authoritative and politically varied ways, like the founding fathers are right up there, right? Like they have the cachet and they have the authority, and you always want a founding father on your side. So I think that Smith is kind of similar in that sense, and that would also support the claim that like this isn't just about Smith. It's about like the Enlightenment as this movement, and also representative of a way of thinking and the kind of like the lost possibilities of like, like optimism and really like a kind of polymath like view of human society that we find kind of unavailable to us today. I'd be curious to hear what Angus or Sophia, if you have thoughts on that question.
I'll only say this. I think that our culture is still deeply steeped in Enlightenment in all kinds of ways. Generally, though, Enlightenment ideas don't come down to us with names attached to them. Most of our, say, moral ideas or epistemological ideas that have Enlightenment roots are not sort of always paired up with a thinker. You don't say, as Voltaire says, or let me get back to Diderot on that. That's not sort of how we talk that much, which is why I asked you a little bit about why it's necessary to evoke Smith and not simply it by name. And it also made me wonder about the sort of larger questions. Couldn't we see Smith a lot of places where people aren't talking about precisely Adam Smith? So in answer to the last question, I would say that, in fact, it's in some ways less significance that we name check certain figures and not others, and maybe more important that a whole set of ideas derived from 18th century thought, and in the case of Locke, the end of the 17th century, have continued to shape so much of our, let's call it, political culture and political economy.
Thank you. Leon Fink, unmute yourself. Join the conversation.
Thanks, Professor Liu. My question is, as you indicated, Smith continues to be yanked in opposite directions by conservatives and liberals, whether picking on the wealth of nations or the moral sentiments. But I'm wondering whether you think Smith is appropriate to think of it in a nationalist context or a more internationalist context. for example, is Smith's, do you think, is he the thinker of the liberal world order, the person who you might most associate with the liberal world order? Or do you think that his own thought is really, the people who use him now are mainly talking in a nationalist context about what should American policy be on this or that, for example, or but do you think Smith is more appropriate to be thought of as really talking about a world order, or was he more of a nationalist thinker from a British or even an American point of view?
Thank you for that. It's a tricky question. I want to say it's like the answer to so many of my questions. Both. On the one hand, Smith is thinking about his immediate context, Great Britain, well, at least for the Wealth of Nations, right? He's thinking about the political economy of Great Britain under the commercial system of mercantilism, or the mercantile system. And so in terms of what he's interested in reforming, he's thinking about it not as a nationalist, like economic nationalism, but he's thinking about kind of what are the policies and principles and ideas that are going to help change what the commercial system that Great Britain is kind of stuck with, that is also expanding globally in Bengal and also in the colonies. So it's maybe you could say it's national in terms of its origin and target, but international in terms of its scope and also its consequences. To say Smith is kind of an architect of like a liberal world order, I think it's not too much of a stretch, but it also kind of worries me about like what that means. To me, it brings up ideas about like hegemony. But that said, that was precisely the worry that many of his interpreters had, right? That's endorsement of free trade was this hegemonic imperialist project, and that's what kind of made it a British conspiracy theory. But Smith himself had a far more tempered view of how international trade would work, and under what circumstances nations needed to pay more attention to, say, like promoting domestic industry and really shielding themselves from kind of beggar thy nation policies, for instance. So, whether you think that that's a kind of like nationalism or internationalism, I'm not quite sure. But the way that I would think about it is like in Smith's mind, the goal is not to create an international order, but to change the way that statesmen, and in his mind, British statesmen, are thinking about the nature of national wealth, which necessarily entails the way that at the time national wealth was this kind of like competitive international project that resulted in different foreign policies. So somewhere in between, I think.
Thank you. Lawrence Glickman has a hand up. I should point out that Larry presented in person at the seminar in our last session in, I believe, March of 2020, before the pandemic shut down, put us temporarily out of business. So, Larry, welcome back.
Thank
even
you.
in the virtual.
Great to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you, Glory, and the other panelists. This has been an absolutely fascinating session. In response to Ellie's question, I did want to mention Zach Carter's book on Keynes, the second half of which I think can be viewed as sort of an American, largely through the lens of Galbraith, but looking at Keynes in America. But my question has to do with two things. One is about plebeian interpretations of Adam Smith. And I came across Adam Smith first when I was writing my book on the idea of the living wage, and was really surprised to see how many working class political economists cited Smith. And I know you mentioned in your book that, labor unionists sometimes talked about him. But one thing in particular that I want to ask you what you think of is that it strikes me that the people that I wrote about who highlighted Smith focused a lot about his ideas on consumption. And I'm wondering if that's part of the Americanization of Keynes, that Keynes wrote about, said that consumption was the sole end of all production. And whether American consumer society might be one reason why people turn to Keynes frequently. Just if you have any thoughts on kind of that the idea that Keynes, as a theorist of consumption, maybe had a special role in the American reception of his work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. Although I would say that maybe it's not just consumption, but really like just the very ordinary human aspects of economic life. One of which is consumption, but also kind of like the more mundane aspects of like ordinary production. I think, for example, it's important that the most famous illustrations of the division of labor in the opening of book 1 of The Wealth of Nations are, there's the pin factory and then the like ordinary wool coat of the day laborer. Smith is really interested in how ordinary people go about meeting their needs, whether it's through consumption, but also their role in the division of labor. So certainly the idea that we measure national wealth in the productivity of ordinary people under the modern division of labor, and that a sign of a very wealthy and healthy country is not just how much gold and silver they can hoard, but whether the necessaries of life are made cheaply and plentifully for ordinary people, right? Like that, it maybe not so much consumerism, but the importance of consumption and whether there's enough for ordinary people to meet their daily needs. It's a very humane and human-centered picture of economic life that kind of grounds Smith's economics that I think, like as you say, maybe contributes to his uptake in America.
Thank you. I want to take the moment to get an observation or question in on my part here. And I was struck reading the book at the ways in which wide range of people appropriate Smith for their own political purposes. This is one of the themes that you take us through time exploring. And just in terms of an observation, it just made me think about the ways in which, in the realm of kind of politics and in scholarship, people draw upon authority figures or people that they want to wrap themselves, in their words. So people working on civil rights, will invoke King, both in politics and in scholarship. Within my own field in African American history, I can't tell you how many times, articles begin with quotes from and homage paid to W.E.B. Du Bois. And in narrower areas, you might signal your politics by invoking and wrapping yourself in C.L.R. James. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of a small version of what Adam Smith is about in this book. And it just sort of reminded me that this is a broader process that both politicians or activists and scholars do. I want to ask about, in the realm of reception theory, what students make of this. And so at the beginning, and I was surprised by this, you talk about, Smith's towering reputation on course syllabi, and that the Wealth of Nations has been assigned on over 5,000 college syllabi nationwide, primarily in economics, but also in history, political science, business philosophy, literature, sociology, anthropology, religion, and law. And the Wealth of Nations ranked 44th amongst millions of books assigned in college courses. Okay, now your footnotes are like unbelievable in the laying out of centuries of Smith scholarship. And you also show how there's been a renaissance, in kind of historical and philosophical explorations of Smith's thought and legacy in recent decades. So I'm just curious, since I'm going to guess that you teach this and you know something about this, what's a college student to make of this today? Are they getting the Milton Friedman version, or are they getting Sam Fleischacker, or now perhaps your version? I'm just curious, since he can be read in so many different ways, why is he assigned? What are professors trying to get their students to think about? And what do students think about?
Yeah. I love this question. So anecdotally, I teach in social studies at Harvard, and the course in which Smith comes up is a course on social theory from Thomas Hobbes all the way to post-colonial theory. And we teach Smith somewhere between, teaching Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Karl Marx. And every time I give the lecture and before I give tutorial, I like to ask students, there are approximately 100 students in the class, give or take a few every year. And I ask them, where have you encountered Smith's ideas? What words, associations come to mind? And without fail, the overwhelming majority of students will say invisible hand, self-interest, capitalism, and economics, right? I encountered Smith in Act 10. So they're not getting Sam Fleischacker Smith. They're not necessarily even getting Milton Friedman Smith. I don't even think most of my students even know who Milton Friedman was. They're getting Greg Mankiw's version of Smith. Or some like lower level Arrow and DeBrew version of Smith. And it's a hand wavy Smith, right? Adam Smith, the founder of economics. Adam Smith gave us this idea of the invisible hand, which maybe is something like either, free markets are allocatively efficient or, kind of something like along the lines of general equilibrium. And when I introduce Smith, I tend to say, well, I'm here to give you a very different version of that Smith. And if you have questions at the end about why we got that version of Smith, or maybe why you learned that version of Smith in your econ class, I can tell you a little bit more about it later. Here now I can say, I wrote this book. But it's to me quite striking and quite telling that among, not that Harvard students are necessarily representative of all university level students in the country. And I really want to resist that, tendency to be like, well, the Harvard undergrad is representative of all college students in the United States. But I will say that I do think that the version that most people know of Smith is the version from their econ, their introduction to economics textbook. Is there a question? Was there a question about kind of what do I do to correct that, or how do I introduce Smith?
Well, curious. Well, I can imagine how you do it. So I'm just mostly, and you've answered the question about what you think students get out of Smith, or at least from their econ classes. And so I guess this suggests to me that the Wall Street Journal reviewer, who has a particular view of what the academy is not thinking about Econ 101 and what kids are learning in that class.
Yeah. It's funny because in social studies, the students are required to take introduction to economics, and then we'll also teach them kind of the social theory that surrounds the theories of the division of labor, for example. And every year I'll have some of my students go, well, this is not how it was taught in our econ class. This is very strange. This is very different. Or when we read the theory of moral sentiments, or I make the students read very, very carefully the beginning of book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, where Smith is kind of breaking down how mercantilism works and why mercantilism, or why the mercantile system kind of became adopted as the system of political economy in Great Britain, which sets up the introduction of the invisible hand metaphor. The students go this is absolutely not the Adam Smith that I expected. This is very, very different, right? He's very, very political. Also, I didn't know about the theory of moral sentiments. Smith is kind of getting inside my head, and he's it's almost like he's inside your brain observing the world around you and then anticipating what you think you're about to say, and then he like comes out and says it. So those are some of the kind of like general reactions and like starting preconceptions that I get from students.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to draw this to a close. It's now 5:30, but I do want to say thank you to Glory, Sophie, and Angus, as well as those of you in the audience. Please join us next week on Monday, April 17th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for a discussion of A Woman's Life is a Human Life, My Mother, Our Neighborhood, and the Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice with author Felicia Kornblue and discussants Sarah Matheson and Karen Gustafson. Thank you all for joining us today. Hope you can join us next week. Thanks. Good night.